Welcome, everyone. Oh, and there's Vince. Good to see you, Vince and Catherine, so many of our friends. I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Inside the Vatican magazine, and we welcome you today to this edition of Writer's Chat. It's a very special edition for us because our own Robert Moynihan, a big day around here. Today is the day that his book is published, his new book, Finding Vigano. This book was a labor of love. It was 18 months in gestation, as we say. And so it's taken a long time. And Robert has done a fantastic job, as you're about to hear. Chris Deirdre, who is his assistant on the magazine, she will be leading Writer's Chat for us today. And we're very grateful. And before we go to Chris and Bob, I just want to do a brief introduction on Robert Moynihan for those who may not know who he is. Dr. Moynihan is founder and editor of Inside the Vatican magazine. He is an American journalist who speaks 5 languages and a seasoned Vatican analysis for more than 35 years. He earned his BA in English, magna cum laude, from Harvard, and an MA and PhD in medieval studies from Yale. Dr. Moynihan is a world-renowned commentator on Catholic issues who has appeared on Fox News, CNN, ABC, and many other international networks. He has written several books, of course, one on Pope Benedict XVI and on Pope Francis, Cardinal Erdo, and a few others. So this is his latest book, Finding Vigano, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Chris, who will take it from here. Chris?
Good afternoon, thank you. I'd like to start by asking Robert a question about the dedication of his book. Robert, you, in your preface, you dedicated the book to your own father, and also you write about fatherhood in general. And I'm just wondering what it was about the whole situation with the Archbishop and in the church right now that led you to choose this as kind of a theme for your book.
Well, thanks, Christina.
Mm-hmm.
I did dedicate the book to my father, Bill Moynihan. He died on the 28th of March, just after the start of the COVID virus. I did not go to see him at the end, and I did not go to his funeral. But we were very close. I'm his eldest son. He encouraged me in my work. He encouraged me to go to Rome and report on the Vatican. And he kind of left me, in a sense, in the middle of finishing the book, which we had discussed. And so I wanted to carry on in his spirit, which was to be, really, he was a US Marine. He had studied in minor seminary to become a priest out at Callicoon, New York, near St. Bonaventure. He was from Haverhill, Massachusetts. He was an Irish Catholic. His brother became a Franciscan friar, and his brother was named Robert Moynihan. So my father named me after his brother, my Uncle Bob, who died many, many years ago. And that was sort of the matrix of my formation. I revered my father. I looked up to him, and we often talked over issues in the church. And in this question of fatherhood, generating life physically, generating life spiritually, and then fatherhood in its deficiencies and in its failings, spoiling a child, even abusing a child. I felt that because we call priests father, because we think of bishops as the fulfillment or the plenitude of the priesthood, and because we call the Pope Holy Father, and because we speak of God himself as our Father who art in heaven. For these reasons, this concept of the generation of life, the generation of personhood, the generation of confidence, the generation of a son who is able to follow in the footsteps of the Father was a central theme in our church and in my life. And it became a crossroads for the church in these recent years in light of the abuse crisis, when fathers, priests were found to be failing in their fatherhood, to be harming innocent ones. And sort of this issue became one of the great issues of our time. How could this have happened? What was the failing? Was it a general cultural problem, or a problem within the church? And so I dedicated the book to my father, and then in the first paragraphs, I talked about this question of spiritual fatherhood.
Mhm.
And I felt that it was something in particular with Vigano himself, because he spoke about his father with great affection. I discovered that his father died when he was just 20, and he was trying to get to his father's bedside, and he was late. And they said, "You've got to come, he's very ill." And he tried to get there, and he had to take either a train or a car from outside of Milan into Milan. His father was a businessman in Milan, and the family lived in Varese, just north of Milan. And he was late. He walked into the hospital room, and his father lay there, had already passed away. But when he spoke of this, his voice vibrated with the memory of that moment. So I knew this connection between son and father was important to him. And when he spoke of Pope John Paul, who made him a bishop, and when he spoke of Pope Benedict, who confirmed him in his, continued to employ him as one of his top officials in the Vatican during Benedict's pontificate, and then made him the nuncio to the United States of America, he spoke with great respect of Benedict. And then when he spoke of Francis, and of course, he made the great denunciation of Francis in his testimony and was regarded as the great opponent or even enemy of Francis. But what I discovered in our conversations is there was a complex emotional relationship also with Francis.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that I have the psychological or spiritual understanding to really explain what that was about, but I attempted to go into it. Because a son or a son, in a sense, a spiritual son who criticizes his spiritual father and says, "You must stop doing what you're doing." Just as a son in a family who looks at his father and says, "Dad, you're going off the rails." That fact does not mean that you hate your father. You actually still love your father, but you're sad that human weakness and human failing have taken him off the path that deep down is the path you long for him to take. And what I found on at least 3 or 4 occasions, Vigano would slip into a phrase, "He must confirm his brothers." He must confirm his brothers, meaning he was meditating on what the role of a pope is, what the role of Peter is, what the role of the Papa of the church is. And that is, in our present circumstances, it's sort of to allow us to make a mess has been the model, which can be interesting in a family, can allow things to flourish. You can see why a father might say, "I want you all to make a mess, to live." But at the same time, if many people are confused, if the world is attacking the church, if different ideas that are not in keeping with tradition are coming in, you also want the father to take a stand and confirm the faith. Vigano said this several times. This persuaded me that the question of fatherhood and sonship, of who is a good son, who is a bad son, who tells the truth to the father and who tells sort of flattering platitudes and praises the father falsely, who's the better son? if you catch my meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So for these reasons, my love of my father, my respect for him, I wanted to dedicate the book to him. And then all of these other reasons, the book in a sense is dedicated to all fathers.
Okay, so you've spoken about the father, and you've spoken about sons and sonship to an extent. What about the Holy Spirit? How do you bring him into this discussion too?
Well, one of the most moving moments of our conversation a year ago, after he had been in hiding for a year and he invited me to come to talk to him. And he first said, I would like you to.
Bob, excuse me,
Yeah.
you're touching the top of your laptop, or there might be a paper on it and it's putting some noise out there.
Okay.
Thank you.
He had first said that I'd like to maybe speak with you over the telephone or exchange emails with you. And I said, no, I have to come see you in person. And finally he agreed. That's sort of the genesis of this project. There was a little phase there where it was unclear what we were going to do. The most moving moment to me was when he was going over his career and I was saying, what did you do then? And how was your ordination to the priesthood? And how was Iraq? He was an official in the Vatican Diplomatic Corps in Iraq. And then he said, I was then chosen to go up for 2 years to London. And one day when I was about 35 years old, I was standing at the window, which from the embassy of the Vatican, the nunciature looks out over a park. And he said, a sparrow came flying over to the windowsill and landed on the windowsill. And I looked at the sparrow and the thought came to my mind that I would never have a son. I would never have a child because I had committed myself to celibacy. And I looked at him and I saw the weight of that decision. And I said, and what did you think as you reflected on that? He said, I came suddenly to the conclusion that there was a spiritual sonship, that I could generate children spiritually, and that I would have to be satisfied and even overjoyed that that choice had been given to me and that I could fulfill that vocation. That type of conversation touched me. So what I slowly came to understand is that there is an interplay between the physical and the spiritual, which is sort of the two strands of the genetic code of our universe and of our personhood. We are physical beings with bodies, but we are also spiritual beings with souls. And the issues in our church and the issues in our culture have to do with balancing or giving due weight to the correct appreciation of the connection and relationship between these two strands. And when they get out of balance, or when one strand is completely eliminated or annihilated, so let's say the spiritual strand, the concept of the soul, the idea that we have an eternal destiny, the idea of something being holy rather than just useful. We have a culture that's materialistic, that's utilitarian. This has annihilated the concept of the transcendent and the concept of the soul. And in a sense, because of this reflection on fatherhood and on generating personhood, led me to the conclusion that the great issue of our time lies right here in this question. So this becomes a matter that we explore in the book in some depth.
So, okay, so following that, what would you say the essence of the book is? Do you have
Okay,
maybe a passage or something?
You asked me before we went on what was my favorite passage, and in part of the preface, which I really labored over, and I worked for several weeks, actually. I drafted it quickly and then kind of like a loaf of bread. I reworked it and reworked it. Originally it was just a few pages and it became about, I'm not even sure, 60 pages long. I wrote, this book is not an attempt either to praise Archbishop Viganò or to blame him. It is rather the account of an attempt to find the man, physically and figuratively. Who is this man who, though a high-ranking Vatican official, an insider, dared to denounce a pope? Who is this man who dared to denounce as corrupt a clerical culture that he himself was part of for a lifetime? Who is this man who says he has no eloquence, yet writes with an undeniable, deeply moving eloquence? Who is this man who went into hiding and yet has found a way to speak from his hiding place to the entire world? In the end, the Vigano I found was a man who smiled, a man who laughed, a man who wept. He was a gentleman, a simple man, a humble man who at age 78 rode a bicycle with a bag of groceries on the handlebars. When the bike skidded in the rain, he took a hard fall and fractured his ankle. Nobody knows that. He actually didn't want me to put that in the book, but yeah, just last year he broke his ankle. He was in a cast for several weeks. He was a helpful man who drove my rented car when I was too tired to drive. He chauffeured me. He was an organized man who took copious notes and made careful plans, yet also a man who could say suddenly, "Bob, the time is short now. We must move fast." And then he would move dizzyingly fast. He was a man with a marvelous memory for names and dates and circumstances. He lived fully in the present, but also fully in his memory, which seemed to have access to crystalline sights from a lifetime ago. The quote, sea of glass, unquote, glacier in the Massif of Mont Blanc in the Alps that filled him with exhilaration when he hiked to it as a boy. The dusty and semi-desert region of northern Nigeria, where he was a nuncio for several years in the 1990s. A man deeply moved by the sight of the face of his dead father, Adeodato Vigano, still and cold in the first hours after his unexpected death in his early 60s when Vigano was just 20. A man of principle, of faith, of dignity, of culture, of sorrow over violence and corruption and deceit, a friend.
Beautiful. So I asked you what the essence of the book was. That's also kind of the essence of the man. Do you have anything else to say about him himself? How his background and his culture, made him the person he is?
He is a representative of Italian Catholic culture. A Catholic culture which has been in relationship with a kind of anti-clerical Catholic culture for centuries, which gives Italian life a type of richness. And really, it's hard to say whether it's harmful or beneficial to the church, if you catch my meaning. They have an attitude towards the purveyors of sacred things, which is very wise and very critical, and at the same time, very respectful. It's complex. So I find Italian culture fascinating and in some ways providential, so that the church both receives the respect of the Catholic people of Italy and is part of their tradition and their blood. And at the same time, they don't have any illusions. They realize people are human. They realize priests may be human. They realize there may be financial interests, etc., political interests. But even with all these realizations, which really are more shocking often to American Catholics, the Italians continue to hold a certain respect for this aspiration for the infinite, for the divine, for the eternal. They don't want it wiped away. So as they become interested in things like communism, the Italians bring a type of spiritual depth to communism, to the idea of dialectical materialism. They even could transform that, which is one of the most interesting developments of the last 100 years. And with Gramsci and with some of the opening of Pope John the 23rd and Paul VI toward the left. Fascinating. I'm not an expert in these things, but it's quite an interesting cultural phenomenon. So then, because he was raised in the Catholic faith by a very deeply believing Catholic family in the Diocese of Milan, the Diocese of Charles Borromeo, St. Charles Borromeo, who died actually in a plague, going to visit the people who had caught the plague, and he caught the plague himself. So it's very timely to think of him. But his name was Charles Borromeo, Carlo Borromeo, and that is Vigano's name, Carlo Maria. So he identifies a great deal with Carlo Borromeo, the great saint in the late 1500s in Milan. And in a sense, there's a place where he talks about in the book, growing up in the shadows of the churches where St. Ambrose, of course, was the teacher of, or the inspirer of St. Augustine. Augustine went to see Ambrose, was astonished when he saw Ambrose reading without moving his lips, because apparently everyone would read almost out loud. Ambrose was a very learned man in the late 300s. He was from the governing class of the Roman Empire and became a bishop almost against his will. They chose him because he was so intelligent, organized. And Ambrose is the model for the Milanese Catholic Church, and Carlo Borromeo is another type of Ambrose. And Vigano, in a sense, imbibed from this stream of great church leaders. And he was very close to, he was confirmed by Cardinal Schuster, made his first communion under Cardinal Schuster, who was a man who looked transparent. He had a kind of shining face and kind of skinny, but as if he was glowing with the Holy Spirit. And he led Milan during the Second World War, when there was tremendous tension and violence and bombing. And then Schuster continued to be the leader of the diocese into the 50s, when Vigano was a student, and Vigano was deeply impressed by this Cardinal Archbishop of Milan. Now, as time passed, Vigano entered into the church. He had both a legal degree in civil law, but then he also entered religious life and took a degree in canon law. So he has kind of a legalistic mind, very clear, argumentative, but also he enjoys the argument. And he can understand if someone makes a counter argument, he can understand, well, that's a telling point, that type of thing. So there's the capacity there, I think, to engage. There's a capacity to engage in argument, which I think is still hopeful for the present moment in the church. That's my hope. Because we are in a difficult moment, and this is a little passage that tries to express the difficulty, which people may think it's too exaggerated, but others may think it's not enough so. What must be done? I asked Vigano. He answered, we have to be clear in our minds, but we cannot continue to hide the facts. We must recognize that there is a project of the devil to destroy the church. The watchwords are a new church, for a new humanism. No more Jesus Christ. This is all Vigano speaking. No more Jesus Christ. No more cross. No more confession and forgiveness of sins. We must fight against this project. Yes, we must fight for the faith. With God's help, with confidence, without pride. The time will come when everything will be out in the open. For now, we must study and pray and prepare ourselves spiritually for what is to come. I am speaking what I see and telling the truth as I see it, he continued. I cannot any longer stay silent. I am going too fast. Yes, but the situation is moving very fast. I know the situation at the top of the church, leaving the church defenseless everywhere. I have tried to go further down to understand why we have reached this situation. They have changed the teaching. This is the reason for accelerating. Certainly, they want to go to the conclusion. The vulnus, the wound, is already there. Pope Francis should be converted by the Holy Spirit. And then he should turn as Peter turned. Remember, Peter denied Christ. We have that always in our tradition. And then when he realized he had done it, he wept bitter tears, if you recall scripture. And then he should turn as Peter turned and confirm his brothers, of whom I am only one. I am just trying to follow my conscience. I am in daily prayer, prayer to our Lord, prayer to Our Lady, asking for light. And I am making a step forward where I can.
So if I could just follow that a little further. So does the Archbishop, how does he see his role in more concrete terms? Is he see himself in a more prophetic capacity as a ringing a bell of alarm, or does he see that he has a more active, specific role? Is that something you have a sense of?
Well, I do feel he feels called to speak, as he just said in that passage, the truth as he sees it, as a bishop, as an archbishop in the church, and to remain faithful to the teaching of the church, the depositum fidei, the deposit of the faith, and that is his way of being faithful. He's been very careful not to go beyond a certain limit. And I think he deeply believes in the unity, the necessity of keeping the unity of the church, although he senses, as a lawyer would sense, that when you're debating over certain questions, there could be a position that has to be rejected and another that has to be affirmed. So he has said to me on several occasions, I am waiting. Hello? I am waiting for a sign. Did you hear me?
Yes, he's waiting for a sign.
Yeah. And he specifically, I can reveal that we discussed at great length things that are not in the book. And these include issues in the election of different popes in the last half century, and the resignation of Pope Benedict, and issues involving that resignation. But these things he has not spoken out about in public, because these things would affect very precise mechanisms of church government and unity. What he has spoken about has been always the teaching as he understands it that has been handed down from the apostles on the essential doctrines of the faith with regard to the centrality of Jesus Christ, the sacraments of the church, in a time which, as I mentioned earlier, there is a general cultural thrust of materialism to de-transcendentalize and to de-Christianize the formerly Christian culture of the West. And right at that point, he has taken his stand and is doing the best that he sees to do with all the limitations on his resources.
Okay, I would like to ask you about Archbishop Viganò's past as far as his career. It seems to me that he was a very dedicated, intelligent, efficient career diplomat for the Vatican. Then later on, he had a very high position overseeing Vatican finances and reform of the financial institutions. Always a quiet, dedicated worker. And then it seems almost like something happened and there was a change, and the Archbishop Viganò that we know today is perceived by many as something of a firebrand and almost a cultural warrior, a defender of tradition and doctrine. And I'm just wondering, did he change, or was there how do you account for the different face of Archbishop Viganò that we see today?
Well, it's a great question. And it's a question I myself have. And I think to a certain degree, the Archbishop himself has the question. We'd have to say he saw his vocation as being a servant of the church and a servant really of the Holy Father, of Holy See. When he was invited into the diplomatic academy, the pontifical academy that trains all of the Vatican diplomats for the diplomatic service, it was the choice of a talented, intelligent young man. Almost everyone who goes there is extremely competent, speaks several languages. And then during his career, and Vigano speaks English almost perfectly, and our conversations were often in English, even though my Italian is pretty good, but he speaks French even better. And then he has a pretty good, I can't really judge his knowledge of Spanish, but he speaks excellent Spanish. He manages in Portuguese. He has an ability to read German, and he has some familiarity even with Arabic because he was in Iraq for some years. Mm-hmm. So he served the Holy See and was sort of following whatever he was asked to do, which career diplomats have to do. They're moved by their governments and they're sent into different situations, and they learn how to deal with church matters and how to deal with political, cultural matters. And through that, how to keep records, how to deal with crises, how to deal with challenges of seminaries, universities, monasteries, parishes, schooling systems, etc. So they are truly like, they have a type of episcopal role overseeing the life of a church in a country. And then they're brought back to Rome and they have a role overseeing all that occurs in the universal church. And when he came back, he first served in Rome at the very end of Paul VI, and then John Paul I, 33 days, and then John Paul II. That was his first period of several years into the 80s. the late 70s into the 80s in the Vatican. And interestingly, I don't put too much of this in the book, but I think we'll come back to it at some future time. He was the one who received the telephone calls at the time of the Emanuela Orlandi kidnapping. She was a young girl of 15 who was kidnapped after John Paul II's assassination attempt in 1981. She was kidnapped in 83, and it seemed as if they had kidnapped her to exchange her perhaps for the shooter, Ali Ajka. And somebody who they called the Americano, with his voice speaking Italian with an English accent, with an American accent. But Vigano said to me, I took the call, and they asked to speak with Cardinal Casaroli, the Secretary of State, to begin some sort of negotiation. He said, I didn't think his accent was American. It was Maltese. But this is just one incident to show that he was in a slot in the Vatican, not at the top as Secretary of State or substitute, but right at the desk next to those men, watching everything that happened in John Paul II's pontificate, then being sent out again to Nigeria after having gone to Strasbourg, the European Union. And when John Paul visited Nigeria, he saw Vigano doing great work. Vigano, in a way, loved Nigeria, did a lot of work there. And he brought him back to the Vatican in 98. And from 98 to 2011, that's 13 years, he was there at the end of John Paul's pontificate and through most of Benedict's pontificate. And it was in those years where he was at the level just under the substitute. He was the assistant of the substitute, who is the Deputy Secretary of State. So you have the Pope, the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, and then a couple of assistants there. So he's the fifth or sixth person to follow events and to look at documents and to pass them to the top decision makers. And that's when the letters came in about Cardinal Mccarrick. And he saw them. They came across his desk. His role was to be the chief of the personnel of the Vatican and the overseer of all the diplomatic delegations, all the nunciatures of the church around the world. And toward the end of that period, he was given a promotion to the Vatican city-state government, like being the assistant to the mayor of Vatican city-state, the country of the Vatican, handling the electricity, the sewage, the garbage, the food, the payment of employees, the upkeep of St. Peter's Basilica, cleaning up St. Peter's Square, issuing money, everything that had to do with the life of Vatican city-state. He was the second to the governor of the state. He was the secretary to the governor and really knew everything. He was the actual hands-on guy. But as he did that work, he started to find ways to save money. Great example being the Christmas tree in St. Peter's Square. People were charging $800,000 and he found a way to do it for $400,000. But people had had contracts and agreements in previous years and became irritated that these were being broken up. Vigano, in the end, saved millions of dollars, but made powerful enemies. And that led to what we call Vati Leaks #1, where people wanted to ease him somehow out of the Vatican and force his departure because they felt he was interrupting business as usual. I am not the ultimate authority on these matters, but I think Vigano was a very efficient, honest, and would have been a wonderful administrative. He wanted to finish his work and to really clean up every type of graft, corruption, extra payment, double payment. And the Vatican would have been moving into a different culture if he had stayed in his post. But his enemies saw to it that he was recommended to Pope Benedict to leave the Vatican and become nuncio to the United States, a very prominent post, but out of Rome, no longer troubling them. So he wrote a letter to Benedict saying, I don't want to leave. But then Benedict wrote to him and said, I have thought it over. I did consider that you could be made the head of the economic affairs of the Holy See because you're so precise in your thinking. But I think in the end, you will have a providential role to play if I send you to the United States. Vigano said he never understood what Benedict meant by that, but only after 5 years in America and then after leaving his post and retiring, did he start to wonder, what could it all have meant? And then he started to develop what you asked about, these thoughts. What could the church do about the culture wars? What could the church do about the abuse, corruption in the church? What could the church do about human freedom and this kind of idea of a global order, which is sort of removing certain human freedoms, controlling people and imposing a kind of new morality and new social vision? Because he spent 5 years and more in America and then retired, these matters percolated in his mind. And actually, during those 5 years, we sometimes would meet and talk. I knew him all those years, and he would discuss these things without taking a position. But he was saying, how do you feel America is going? How is the climate for families? How is the climate for the church, for schools, for universities? And I was saying, we have a lot of challenges. We have a culture which is denying the transcendent. It's a materialist, consumerist culture. And to restore it and to propose once again Jesus Christ in this culture is a great task. So I think these questions reverberated in his mind. But then when he went back to Rome in 2016, and after the visit of the Pope to America in 2015, and the encounter between Pope Francis and Kim Davis, and the outrage in circles in the Vatican and in the American Church that such a meeting had been arranged, Vigano had been promised he would be kept in Rome in an apartment next to St. Peter's Basilica, and the leadership asked him to give up the apartment and give it back. So when you're in Rome, you're always looking for a nice place to live. And I myself have had to change lodgings on a number of occasions for different reasons. So it's the old apartment problem. And he felt that he had been, in a sense, brushed aside. And people who have followed the story emphasize that. And I agree there's an element there that he, after a lifetime of outstanding service, seemed to be thrust aside for ideological reasons. Then he spent another year thinking about it. And then finally he saw the great scandal of Cardinal Mccarrick break open in 2018. June 20th, the Archdiocese of New York said there are allegations against him that we deem credible for the first time of abuse of a minor. Mccarrick himself resigned from the cardinalate, very rare thing that happens. And then there was administrative action taken against him in early 2019 to laicize him. He's no longer a priest. So we would rightly say Mr. Mccarrick. But the other thing happened in the summer of 18 was this Pennsylvania grand jury report, which spoke of hundreds of cases of abuse in Pennsylvania by priests over 60 years. There are many different evaluations of that report, but the media presented it to the country, and the Catholic population in general and Americans in general said, what has happened to this Catholic Church? How could there be so many cases? Mm-hmm. And in that context, because day after day, I don't know if you remember that summer of 2018, day after day, Catholic Church filled with abusive priests, particularly in Pennsylvania, but also, other places. Mm-hmm. Vigano then issued his testimony saying, there's a kind of culture of cover-up, which we have to end. And that's when he became famous.
Mm-hmm. So real quickly, I just want to ask you about the Mccarrick Report vis-a-vis Archbishop Viganò. I know you wrote a brief analysis of the report issued by the Vatican right after it came out, and you characterized it as featuring 4 scapegoats, and one of them was Archbishop Viganò himself. And I wonder if you could explain just briefly what that means and how Vigano was presented in the report and how it squares with Vigano's own words and what you think.
Okay, thanks for another softball question. I could talk about this for a couple of hours, and I've only got 4 or 5 minutes. And I really want to take some questions as well. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I did write there are 4 scapegoats in this report. How did Mccarrick rise, and how come the rumors about him, which date back to the 1980s and even perhaps the 70s, were not considered by his other church brethren who made decisions about his career, and finally by John Paul II, and then also by Benedict, and then by Francis, the popes. Why was his career promoted and never halted? And the report was supposed to answer that question. But they answered by saying there were reports made, but John Paul didn't believe them, so he's to blame. John Paul's secretary, Stanislaw Dziwisz, now Cardinal Archbishop Stanislaw Dziwisz, received a letter from Mccarrick in 2000 or late 1999, when Mccarrick was being proposed to move. He had been a bishop in Metuchen, New Jersey, then he'd been moved to Newark, New Jersey. Cardinal O'Connor had sent a letter to Rome saying there's some rumors that I'm concerned about. There's no proof, but we're concerned that it might be something we shouldn't do to promote him either to Chicago or to New York. And then the third place was Washington. He said, I don't think we should do it. So he wasn't promoted to Chicago. He wasn't promoted to New York, but Mccarrick wrote a letter to Don Stanislaw and said, tell the Pope that I have always kept my vows. I've never broken them. I have not broken the vow of celibacy. I've kept it. And John Paul looked at this letter, and we don't know what else came across his desk or who else spoke with him, but for whatever reason, he chose Mccarrick to be the Archbishop of Washington, and Mccarrick was there from 2000 to 2006. And this report said it was Dziwisz, who was some way close to Mccarrick, Dziwisz, the secretary of John Paul, Mccarrick, who had come to Rome, and it does acknowledge that he had handed out $1,000 here and $5,000 there and supported this, maybe this convent, or supported this project. So he became regarded as the American bishop who knows where the pockets are and can help people in Africa, in Asia. So people liked him for that reason. So they had an emotional reason or a financial reason for not wanting to believe allegations about him. And then 2006, Vigano wrote a report because Father Boniface Ramsey and others had sent letters to the nunciature saying, there's too many allegations. We've met with priests who say someone has molested them, that Mccarrick has molested them. And Vigano wrote a report saying we should take some type of action. You guys who are the bosses, I think on the basis of this evidence, my recommendation as a staff guy would be take some action here because this is a smoldering case and it's too much harm is being caused. But they set that aside, and then Benedict finally said, okay, I'm not going to issue an official denunciation or condemnation. I'm going to say this, all of these allegations mean that the wisest thing for you, Cardinal Mccarrick, is to go now into a quiet retirement. Do not travel, do not speak publicly. But it was not an official sanction. It was an order. It was a request, but Mccarrick always opposed it and flouted it. And so nobody knew. And what people say is this was a problem of Benedict's government and the report itself. So Benedict, being a man of study, of theology, a professor who never wanted to be even a bishop. He wanted to stay a professor, but John Paul made him a bishop of Munich. Sorry, not John. Paul VI did in 1977. Benedict then became an ecclesial figure, worked in the Vatican for the rest of his career, and in a sense, never was in a way happy there because he really liked being a professor. And then was elected Pope, but he never wanted to be a governor. He wanted to entrust someone like Cardinal Bertone with those types of decisions. So the report says Benedict didn't act in a clear enough way. So he's the third scapegoat. And then they say the fourth scapegoat or the fourth culpable is Vigano himself, because after he was in late 2011 sent to America, early 2012, he's just been in America a month or two, he gets a request from Cardinal Ouellette to say, we've got one other rumor about Mccarrick now, who by that point is 82 years old. And the thought, I think, was that he's pretty old, he might pass away, the case will close, he's not so active anymore. These things are related to the 70s and to the 80s, maybe the 90s, but maybe nothing today. So Vigano was asked to check on something in New Jersey, and Vigano says he did make a call and it was handled verbally. He investigated verbally, but the report says he didn't investigate. So there's a disagreement there. But Vigano is blamed as late as 2012, not investigating Mccarrick sufficiently. So he's the fourth scapegoat of this report. And the report says there was no blame at all of Pope Francis, who then in 2013 starts to ask Mccarrick again to go on missions for the Vatican to places like China, even as he's now in his mid-80s. So there's a lot more that could be said about this, but the report was judged by myself and by a lot of other people as not really explaining that group that somehow supported and appreciated Mccarrick and kind of winked at any of his actions that weren't good. And I think that whole aspect remains unexplored, and there's more to explore on why Mccarrick was so powerful that may relate to, there's reports on the internet now that he was approached both by the KGB and the FBI back in the 80s to be kind of an agent or a double agent. And all of that is very murky and unclear, but Mccarrick was close to our government, was close to the Chinese government, made trips to Russia. And therefore, there's something here, I think, that would warrant further investigation if we really want to understand his story.
Bob, we've been going for almost an hour now, and we have several questions that have stacked up in chat. And there are people who've queued me or asked me privately if they could ask questions. So I think we should get to questions and answers now.
Okay, well, how was that so far? Was it of any interest?
It was wonderful. It was very good. Thank you. As we all know here in the office, what difficulty it was to come up with the final edition of this book. So,
Oh, I have to reveal a secret. And I became so concerned about contributing to division in the church, which I don't want to do, although I do want to call a spade because my father always told me to do that without fear or favor. He said, try to be someone who tells the truth. But I didn't want to tell the truth in a way that would harm the church. So I have lost about 35 pounds in the past year as I prepared this book. I don't know why that's happened, but I think I'm just burning up inside.
well, thank you, Bob. I'd like to have our first question. Jim Bertrand, if you can unmute yourself and you can go ahead and ask Bob your question. You're still muted.
Again here.
I can hear you now.
Yeah,
Hi, Jim. Hi, Jim.
Just very briefly, Bob, I had a quick question. Is Vigano receiving any support or feedback, privately from some of the other princes of the church? I'm thinking of Cardinal Sarah of Africa, Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Mueller, perhaps in Germany. Is he getting any support or feedback from them privately? Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question and a natural question.
Okay, let's repeat the question just in case some people didn't hear it. You want to repeat the question, Bob?
Is Vigano receiving any support or feedback from other princes of the church, from cardinals or archbishops? We have to make a clarification. Vigano is not a cardinal. Vigano is an archbishop. So the College of Cardinals contains a group that is more sort of regarded as conservative, traditional. People would disagree on precisely where to place people. And there can be discussions about that. But Cardinal Sarah from West Africa, with whom I have spoken many times and who has expressed his love of the church, and he is regarded as a person who wants to fight against this kind of consumeristic, materialistic culture. And so he's regarded for those reasons as a conservative. And he's been in touch with Vigano, and they did, however, have a small confusing disagreement at the time when Vigano issued a statement on the appeal to the world regarding the coronavirus as some sort of a mechanism to move towards a global order that would have greater control of travel and of people's lives. That appeal came out in May. Sarah and Vigano had spoken about Sarah signing it, and then Sarah either called or texted and says, I'm taking back, in my position as cardinal, I don't think I can sign it. And Vigano had just pressed the button, I think an hour earlier, and sent it out with his signature. So he withdrew, but he said he didn't insert it without having had the cardinal's approval. It was that the cardinal had changed his mind. Cardinal Mueller, former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, very close to Pope Benedict, is, I don't know if they are in contact, but they read certainly. Vigano on his computer is capable of reading what we are all capable of reading and peering in And because of his languages and because of translation, he can see what's appearing in Italy, what's appearing in France and Germany and Spain and in the United States, Canada, etc. He has a capacious mind and a work ethic. So he's following things. People also are sending, a lot of journalists now have gotten into contact with him in the past year, and they send things or ask questions or note things to him. He's particularly close to Aldo Maria Valli, a journalist in Rome, who from Milan, who used to be a leading correspondent for the Italian television agency RAI, and then started to raise questions about certain issues in this pontificate and lost his job. But he's friendly with Vigano. Vigano had come to him just before he published his testimony and spoken with him, had dinner at his house. And Valli is a quite impressive Italian journalist. And Marco Tossati, whom I knew already in the 1980s when we were in the press office in Rome as young guys together. And he had a career in the Vatican journalism and writing for different Italian papers. Now he has his own blog, and Stilum Curiae, Marco Tossati, and he is someone who can receive a text that Archbishop Viganò will email to him, publish it, and he now also puts it quickly into English if it's in Italian, and also into Spanish. And there's contact with some of the American Catholics, like LifeSite News, The Remnant with Michael Matt. Vigano actually was invited, and on one occasion in the past year appeared in public in Munich, Germany. He kind of parachuted in and covered himself in a winter coat, and he only had this much of his face showing. But somebody recognized him as he stood with about 200 people in front of in a square in Munich, in front of the bishops of Germany, to protest their proposed synodal path, which is going to revisit the question of married priests, women priests, and other questions of sexual morality and marriage. And he stood with 100 or 200 people in the back, and somebody, I think from Gloria TV, noticed him and came over and took a picture of him. You can find that on the internet. And on that occasion, he also met with Michael Matt and exchanged, Michael was there, and they exchanged emails. And so he's been in touch since then, and with Taylor Marshall, and with a kind of group of more traditional Catholic journalists in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in the United States, are able to be in contact. The other cardinals, a cardinal from Holland, 8, is regarded, because he's taken a strong stand against the so-called gender ideology, which speaks of the fluidity of our gender and calls for a recognition that these are socially imposed sexual roles, to be a man or to be a woman or to be a father or a mother. And this is becoming increasingly prominent in our culture, to the point where people like Joe Rogan on his 100 million radio podcast, video podcast, have started to say it's causing a rippling series of effects on dozens and hundreds and now thousands of young people who want to change from being a girl to a boy or boy to a girl. Mostly it's girls to boys. And this Cardinal Ait in Holland has opposed this. He said, this is terrible. This confusion at the center of a human identity is harmful. And he has been sharply criticized for that by more progressive people. But he is interested in Vigano's career and what Vigano has been saying about the challenges to the faith. And then there's an old cardinal, 90 years old now, Brand Muller, who he's like a brain on top of a small and aging body. He's super smart. And he was probably the greatest historian we've had, a Catholic historian of the Reformation. Pope Benedict liked him because he was a professor and he made him a cardinal. Brad Muller now lives in Rome next to St. Peter's Basilica. He's been even slightly critical of Benedict, who made him a cardinal. He said, Benedict, perhaps you shouldn't have resigned, or you should have made clearer why and what you were doing. And Brandmuller has expressed concern about certain theological trends in this pontificate, which echo some of the things Vigano has said. So in this way, there's 3, 4, 5 cardinals that have expressed some interest or seem to dovetail in their concerns, but it doesn't, to my knowledge, it doesn't extend much beyond that. So we are speaking of a small group.
Thank you, Jim, for your question. Bob, we have a question in chat from John Myler, which tags on to this question, and I think you've somewhat answered it. His question is that you know Cardinal Erdo well. That was your previous book. Is there any connection between Vigano and Erdo?
No.
Okay.
Not that I know of.
Another question in chat from Teresa Bell from Canada. Welcome, Teresa. Your title, did you come up with your title before, during, or after you were writing the book?
About halfway through. I said, you know, I originally thought I'd be done in about 2 months, but I had so much material because we taped everything, so I've got a kind of an archive here that transcribed is over 2,000 pages. And I said, I've got to find a thread here that can take the weight of one book of about 300 or 400 pages, because people just can't read 1,000. And I said, it has to be the man. And I said that this idea of finding him, that when he went into hiding, I said, finding Vigano. And it just came to me as I tried to cut the book down and concentrate just on the question of who he is. So who he was as a boy, his training. That's, what do I say here? This is more than the story of a physical finding. It is also the story of finding out the secret and center of a man. What he loves, what he lives for, what he dreams about, what moves his soul, what has broken his heart. Now, one thing I didn't say, and I can end, I'm sorry that I'm going on so long, but certain things happened which, as everybody knows from their own lives, are inexplicable. And Deb and I led pilgrimages for about 13 years now to the Vatican, and we would go into the St. Peter's Basilica. We'd say, here's St. Peter, and here's St. John Chrysostom, and here's Josaphat. And in the very back left-hand corner of the Basilica, we found this image of Mary, Mother of the Church. And it's a beautiful chapel, the very back left-hand corner of St. Peter's Basilica. And we finally said, this will be our favorite and special chapel. Okay, so we would bring pilgrims there, and we said, this is our favorite and special chapel. Let's say a little prayer. And we're at the very back corner of the church. Now we'll visit the whole basilica. But here, Mary, Mother of the Church, this is where we sort of start our pilgrimage. Vigano told me in one of our very first conversations after I found and met him, I said, you know, where did you celebrate Mass when you were working in the Vatican? And he said, every morning at 7 a.m., I would go to the sacristy, I'd vest, and I try to be the first one out because it's all first come, first served. I would go to the back left-hand corner of the church and I'd celebrate Mass at the altar of Our Lady, Mother of the Church. Every morning for years, I celebrated Mass there. Well, that and a couple other things which I either don't remember or don't want to mention led me to feel that there was some meaning to our friendship and to trying to write something about him. And I thought, how can I help to protect his image from becoming one of a rogue or exalted ideologue and remain focused on the fact that he's a bishop of the Catholic Church with a deep conviction that the church is to be lived for and loved for and protected. And I said, I have to do this book for that reason.
Bob, this goes to one final question. Maybe we'll have time for a few more. Someone has asked, so will there be another book since you have so much material?
Yes.
And what is that book going to be on?
Reading Vigano.
Okay. Well,
we're going to collect the writings and I'm going to explain them and how he evolved to a critique of our entire culture, step by step, from the question of sexual abuse and of culture of cover-up and flawed clergy to the question of global order, of conflict between mega global corporations and sort of populism and people with living their lives in freedom, and the question of the Second Vatican Council itself and the extent to which there was an insertion of a type of modernism into the church.
oh, he's frozen. He'll come back in just a moment. But I do want to let everybody know, Bob, you froze for a moment. So I wanted to let everybody know we are giving a free giveaway with everyone who's present here. And we have a random system that the internet has all of these things. You can upload a list and
maybe I can win too.
No, I don't think you're eligible according to Katie's rules. So Mr. Frank LeQuinn, you have won a free autographed copy. So our office will be in touch with you. For everybody who's on the chat, there's a link or who's on this Zoom chat, there's a link in chat where you can go and you can order the book. On December 16th at 1 p.m., it'll be your time. I know not all the questions were answered, but it'll be your time. Bob really won't be given any lead-ins, and anyone who has ordered the book will be invited to a very special questions and answers, and we hope to have a special guest with us that day as well. We're still working on it. So if you would like to be included and be invited into that special chat, please go ahead and order the book. If you have any questions, you can always just send an email to our U.S. office at insidethevatican.com. If the group gets too big, we will have several because we want to keep it intimate so people can feel like they can ask the questions. We'd like for you to read the book and then from the reading of the book to ask the questions because there's a lot of information in there. A lot of people sent in a question, Bob, and I'll let you finish with this because a lot of people sent in one topic they wanted you to talk about. And you touched upon it for the subject of your next book. It's Vatican II. And I knew I know you, so I know the answer would not be short. So I wanted to let everybody know first about the next event on December 16th to ask you questions before you got into this heavy, long answer. Basically, Vigano, Vatican II, what your thoughts are, why is he bringing this up now, etc.
Yeah. Well, first, I have to say that I lived through it. Second, I have to say my father told me to be careful. He said, Bob, don't idealize too much the pre-conciliar church. I said, what do you mean, Dad? He said, there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of scrupulosity. There was a lot of externality. That's what I grew up with. But there was deep beauty. There was deep faith. There was a connection between the intellectual and the washerwoman. she would do the rosary beads, and he or she would reflect on the whole history of the church. There was a connection between man and God. He was present to us, and we were convicted, you know, of the necessity, but we also were living, and we would fall, and we would then say we would need to make ourselves right with God. He said the difference in the post-conciliar period is that we have tended to feel that there is no need to be so scrupulous, no need to do penance, no need for forgiveness. Everything is okay. And this, in a way, is a danger for our souls that comes with a type of lighthearted, post-conciliar, humanistic vision of things. So therefore, from his description of things in that way, I've reflected on this myself now, because I was a little boy at that time. And Vigano, I think, had not so many questions at all about Vatican II, but as he saw some of the fruits that have emerged, the absolute decline of confession to almost nothing. Also of the other sacraments. In other words, the sacred has wilted away, has eroded away. Vows of all types, religious and marital. And the danger is that we lose a sense of our own depth, of our own dignity. The very fact of receiving the freedom to do as you will and to be as you will means that you might lose the idea that you have such dignity as a soul that you have to repent because you're trying to save that dignity. And this is something we've lost, and it's a difficult fight, but Vigano started to feel that in losing this, we had lost a pearl of great price. We'd lost a connection with the holiness of God, and he somehow felt it was an exaggerated interpretation of Vatican II, something that had been woven into Vatican II by a certain cultural trend as the 60s were a time when the world itself was, including the Protestant world, was being attracted to this new freedom, this new humanism, we might call it. So to attack Vatican II, it's not correct. It's to analyze the new humanism and say, where does this endanger the true dignity of man? And this is the thing that I think still needs to be addressed. And it will be very difficult, but interesting.
Thank you, Bob. Do you want to take a few more questions, or what? Or it's...
I don't want anyone to feel that they didn't get something that they were hoping to get, or I'd love to hear a comment and how we could improve.
Well, if you could do short answers, we can maybe do a few more. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and then just ask Bob a question directly? Just hold down your space bar. Stephen, go ahead.
Oh, how do I do that?
Just hold down your space bar and keep it held down and you'll be unmuted. We can't hear you still. And you are unmuted. So for some reason, your microphone might not be working.
Unmuted.
We hear you.
Unmuted.
No, you're not.
And it's not working. I'm so sorry. Who else? When you can raise a hand or go unmuted.
Yeah.
Sandra Lee
Hi.
Moynihan.
Yes. Hi. I wanted to ask you, with your
That's our
time.
same name.
Yes, we do. And I'm here with Robert Moynihan, my husband.
Robert Francis. My father was Francis Robert from Little Falls, New York. Funniest Christian Catholic I ever knew.
So, yes, so we were very delighted to be with you. And we wanted to ask about your experience with Dr. Vigano, with Archbishop Viganò. If you had, if you could summarize what he would suggest that he feels that those of us who are conscious of this divide right now, what can we do, to respond, to try to actually bring it back, bring back the real church with the honor and the holiness of sacraments and the repentance, the innocence that people have through repentance.
Well, I think it's a good question, and I would say in your daily life, try to readjust, if you can, whatever is not in keeping with your own beliefs and your own convictions. Try to purify and deepen your Christian faith in your daily life by adding perhaps some every day, some prayer, and then something we used to talk about charitable acts towards a neighbor or a family member. Just choose to do something. See if there's somebody that's in despair, and try to offer hope. If there's someone maybe that you could visit once in every, well, of course, we're under the virus now, but could you do something, an act of charity? We used to say there were 4 things, and these acts are, in a sense, a grace that God working through you gives to other people. So if there's someone you see in your family that's lonely, or a neighbor, that would be a start. Once grace starts to flow, and there's a kind of reflection also in your own life, if there's something that you want to do to make up for something you did in the past, go ahead and do it. If there's someone you stole something from, say, by the way, I stole this from you here, I'll give it back. And then try to make some contact with some people in your church. And if there's a adoration chapel, spend maybe some time on a particular moment, and then find some reading material, particularly the Bible, and then the missal to read the prayers. And in this way, begin to start to breathe the sort of air of a universe which has a level of meaning and personhood that transcends just the day-to-day profit making and surviving and consuming that tends to mark our own culture. So we return to a kind of Catholic vision of wonder, of sacramental life. And I think this is mostly my own ideas, but I don't think the Archbishop would disagree. He does a daily prayer, daily mass. So that's what
He has a beautiful devotion to Our Lady. Beautiful devotion to Our Lady. His mother wove that into the fabric of their family.
Oh, that's his earliest memory, saying the rosary with his mother.
Beautiful devotion. Bob, we have a question from a dear friend of yours, a longtime friend. Dan Schmidt would like to ask you something.
Oh, Daniel.
Bob, can you hear me? Am I okay, Deb?
Yes.
You're okay, Dan.
Yeah, just a quick.
Because where are you, Dan?
I'm in Milwaukee, putting up Christmas. Actually, my spouse is putting up Christmas decorations. I'm watching this presentation, waiting for the book myself to take a look at it after all these months of discussing it on and off with you. But a quick question on something. If we still have some listeners, they may be intrigued or have some curiosity about this. And this goes back to the bishop's time here as nuncio and his familiarity with the United States, not just the Mccarrick case, but your conversations with him and his own gathering of intelligence about the states. Recently, we know that he's corresponded with President Trump and about various issues, including some of which you covered in this. Can you just give a few paragraphs on how he, now removed from the United States, sees the American situation in the context of something you'll be taking up in the next book, a sort of conversation more at length about sort of the culture, a sort of global reset and so forth. So I don't want you to go on. I know people have been very patient listening, but they might be interested in his insight into the situation, especially given the United States' role not just in the Western world, but in the world in general, in politics, economics, and culture.
Dan, these are interesting issues. Vigano believes that Trump won the election and that he will win. He said that to me. He also believes that there are very powerful forces that do not want that to happen. He also does not think that Trump is a perfect person by any means, but he feels that he is oddly and mysteriously chosen to represent something human, something in that sense good, free, against a type of system, a kind of global technocratic system which threatens human freedom. He's persuaded of this. I'm not fully sure of my own judgment of these questions, but he believes that we are at a critical moment in terms of establishing global laws for travel, for vaccinations, for economic independence, as opposed to, say, having a social credit score, which would be such that if you did something antisocial, they will turn off your credit card and your bank account from a certain button somewhere, and you would never have a chance to buy or sell anything. This due to the enormous power of the computer. Now we're at quantum computing. Computers which also apparently can shift votes if they're programmed in that way. This world seemingly coming in 2100 or 2200 has actually come in 2020. And he feels that this is a decisive moment, not that the man Donald Trump is a saint, but that for some mysterious reason, he still reflects an old way of being human, as opposed to a system which has chosen as its protagonists members of the Democratic Party. And they, together with some of these tech company owners and giant programmers, are kind of a hive of people who are many of them well-meaning. They want us to be more efficient, just in time production of things, but at the same time, they want humanity to get in line and to be sort of numbered and given some sort of mark of some sort. So he does see it in terms of the book of Revelation in many ways.
Thank you, Bob. One more question, anybody else?
May I ask one?
Yes.
Dr. Moynihan, has Mccarrick suffered any kind of legal ramifications from his actions, or are they saying that these were adults?
There's two different questions. They are saying that most of the cases were adults, and in a certain way, there are no charges brought on that I know of on nearly all of those cases, and no one regards them therefore as crimes. And there's a different perspective in terms of abuse when someone is an adult, and there's a kind of thought that there's a consensual two adults doing something. It's not a crime, but it misses the fact that anybody who's a seminarian, for example, is totally under the control in a power relationship with his bishop. So therefore, it's of its very essence, it's a type of abuse of authority, to take any sort of advantage, ask any sort of favor of any type. And the church has a wonderful tradition in our canon law of protecting the rights of people, of, say, nuns who are being sort of ordered around by the Mother Superior. We have a wonderful tradition of protecting human rights and human freedom in our canon law, and we should follow our canon law. We should honor the beautiful canon law tradition that we have. And if there are any gaps in that canon law, we should repair them and improve them. So Mccarrick has never been charged publicly. He's never gone on trial. And it would also necessarily be said he never has admitted or confessed that the accusations against him are true. He has never accepted that. He's now 90. I believe he's living quietly. Well, we knew that he was living in Kansas for a while in a sort of a kind of, what type of place was that, Deborah? Was it a monastery?
It's a monastery.
Mm-hmm. And we were even thinking of driving out, because I've met Mccarrick and I know Mccarrick, and I was thinking he might even talk to me at some point if I went and knocked on the door. But then he was said to have left there. Some people reported him near Jacksonville, Florida, but then I was told that's not the case. So I don't know where he is now. And no criminal indictments against him. And there were 2 cases that I know of where he paid some amount through the diocese to an accuser in order to settle an accusation. I don't know, it wasn't too many thousands of dollars, and the accusation therefore did not go forward.
Okay. So one question I'm going to bring in, because it's going to wrap up a few questions. It'll be the last question. And it tags on to what Barbara just asked you, because it was a question about Mccarrick. Was he tried? We know that Pell was tried, and Teresa Bell points out what a contradiction. And another question came in earlier, like how does Bell fit, Cardinal Pell from Australia, how does he fit into all this? And I know that you probably would like at least to leave a comment about what he says when he went back to Rome. So.
Okay, Pell, I've met Pell, I've spoken with him, had coffee with him, and he's in my connection and relationship with him, he's a fine, wonderful man, and he's hated in Australia because he's such a good Catholic, and there's a strong sort of humanistic thread that accuses the Catholic Church of being anti all sort of things. And so Pell, being one of the great leaders of Catholicism in Australia, was attacked by progressive secular forces in Australia. Pope Francis thought Pell would be a good man to clean up the Vatican finances, so he brought him to Rome right after he was elected, and Pell was installed as the head of the Vatican economy, the office of the Secretariat for the Economy. Now, Pell is an Australian. The Vatican is Italian at its heart. And if you're not Italian, you have to probably be Spanish. And for the Americans and Australians, you have to become a little bit Italian in order to be successful in the Vatican. Pell had the Pope behind him, but he had Italians next to him who were resisting his efforts to bring clarity to certain accounts. But then he manages to push his way in through a couple of doors, and he says, he announces publicly, I've discovered $1.1 billion in accounts that are off the books. That appeared in the press about a year after he was starting his work. So among the people in the Curia who are not entirely saintly, there were a few who make business deals, and they said, we've got to resist this man. And Pell then slowed down and slowed down and slowed down in his reform work because it became impossible to continue to push forward almost by physical force. And of course, in economics, you can always have a second set of books. You could say, here's my books. This is, I spent $100, 10, 11, 12. And then the second set is what you really spent. You spent $1 million or 1,000. So whether he was getting to the heart of the problem, I don't know. But sometime in about 2017, it was clear that he was getting closer to breaking through to some information about how funds had been misused. Right about that time, allegations were made in Australia of something that happened in the 1970s. When was can someone check what the allegation, what was it, the 80s or 90s? I just lost memory of when the allegation dated from. I think it was the early 90s then, so 20 years before. That he had done something, abused an altar boy at the end of a liturgy on the very first day, I believe, that he had become the Archbishop of a cathedral in Sydney or Melbourne, which place? Anyway, Melbourne. So he went back. He didn't even need to go in terms of international law. He wasn't extradited, but he said, I'm going to go back and stand trial and prove my innocence. The second altar boy had said all along to his mother, even before he died, the second altar boy had died. And he had told his mother, Pell didn't do anything to us, it was made up. And that evidence, I don't think, was introduced in the trial, but it was printed in the newspapers. So the one accusation was brought to trial, and Pell was condemned and went to prison. But then he appealed. He was the appeal didn't work, and then he appealed the second time to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, this evidence is not persuasive. We don't uphold the conviction, and they released Cardinal Pell. He then, he's now come out with a beautiful prison journal and describing what it feels like to be a prisoner for months and months on charges that are not true. And then he went back to Rome, and he's in Rome now, and he's being repositioned to go back into the Vatican and continue to investigate the finances. And just as this has happened, there's been new charges against other Vatican officials of financial corruption. So complicated that I myself am a little bit confused of who is accused of what. But I think there probably needed to be someone like Archbishop Viganò. If I were Pope Francis, I would bring in Archbishop Viganò and say, you handle the financial corruption and straighten it out for us, for all of us, using where you need him, using Cardinal Pell with his physical strength, because he was a rugby player. He's a big, strong man, although he's obviously getting older now. But a man like Archbishop Viganò, being Italian and having so many years experience and knowing everyone and having a memory of everyone's movements, would be the best choice to clean up the Vatican.
Well, thank you, Bob. I know part of your agony, if you will, in these last 18 months to put this book together, at the crux of it was you didn't want it to be a divisive publication for the body of Christ. And you wanted to always go towards Christ. So I think as we wrap up, perhaps you might want to share some comments on that. Because this is this has been a very heavy topic.
I mean, I can say very honestly that Vigano actually shed a tear as he reflected at the beginning, as he reflected on his relationship with Francis, Pope Francis. And he said, I went to him as a totally loyal and faithful servant, and I wanted to help him in any possible way to carry out his ministry, which I am committed to support with my life, with my soul as a priest, to support the mission to preach Christ to the world because he protects our soul. He saves us from sin. He heals us from selfishness and from irrationality. He's the reason of the world, the logos of God, the word of God. He offers to humanity a way up and out from our stubborn, selfish egoism, which leads to cruelty and misery. Therefore, the church as his bride must carry the message of Christ to the nations, to the ends of the earth, throughout all time. And that's all true. The best, and the example of history with all the hospitals that have been built, with all the schools, show that Christians have loved their neighbors and have acted in the place of Christ to heal and to do charitable deeds, to be good mothers and fathers, to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and help their children. So we even now are still attempting to be what we are called to be. And Vigano himself, I think, can be understood as a man who was disappointed in himself, that in spite of committing his life, he still was not able to carry out fully his mission to witness to Christ, to speak out against things that harm human dignity, to find words that would be persuasive. And he said, since I'm becoming old and I will soon face my judgment, my final judgment, I will now redouble my efforts to finish the race with a final sprint. He was very proud of telling me that up until 2 years ago, he could still run. He said, my legs have always been good. But I think he wants spiritually to pour out everything before the end and speak in favor of Christ and invite his brother bishops to come forth as well and to bear witness to Christ. And just as in the 4th century in the Roman Empire, and the question of the Arians and the question of the divinity of Christ, which is the key to the connection between man and what is divine, between man fallen and man redeemed. We cannot simply follow another prophet. We must follow the Son of God. And so Athanasius protected the faith, and Vigano, I think, is protecting the faith, and he would love to have others agree with him and to stand with him and to preach Christ with him. And if necessary, to advise him, encourage him, or even offer a critique, but to know that we are called to preach Christ to the nations and to ourselves, and to carry out what we preach if we fall short, and return always to the right path, the narrow gate, the way that leads to blessedness.
Hello, I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Urbi Orbi Communications. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking the red subscribe button, and make sure you click that bell and you'll be notified of any new uploads. Also, check out all the links below. There's some discounts for you. Thank you.